Hello. I say hello as I welcome myself within your sensorium. It's nice to be here. And I hope it's nice for you. If you're watching this, I question your sanity as a human being. However, I think I respect your insanity because having just re-listened to the last video in this series, because it's been a couple of weeks since I've been able to get to these videos. In some sense, I think Heidegger, as often the case, is demonstrating in the way he's addressing what he's addressing, the point in which he's coming to. Like the way he's going about it is an enactment of, you could say, for lack of a better word, the conclusion which he's addressing. And, in some sense, he's talking about that in a time where we flee in our technological age, where we flee into the complicated. We flee from ourselves in the complicated, in the myriad of beings. And we get entangled in the complicate, how complicated it is, not the complex, but the complicated. That our progress in understanding what is most complicated is a kind of relaxation and an endarkenment, right? A covering over of what is most difficult, right? Which is the most simple. And that which is the most simple is the question of truth and the question of being. And so the way that Heidegger is, going around and around and encircling, right, this question, is quite difficult. I mean, there's these sentences that he's using. I was like listening to the last video, and I'm like, I can barely hold in my short-term memory all the things he's addressing in each sentence by the end of each sentence, right? There's so many things that he's gathering, right? That's really difficult to hold in mind. But the what he's gathering itself is the most simple, right? Not the myriad in the complications of the multiplicity of beings and how they all work and fit together, but in some sense, the through line through all of those, right, is the thing that's most covered over, and thus the most strange, and thus the most unquestioned. And so he is seeking to question that by going through the tradition that in some sense covers over, yet in covering over preserves the original question of truth. So that's what we're up to in this reading. And I'm currently sitting in, I'm excited to be here in Toronto. That's why you don't see Heidegger behind me, because I don't have my green screen. Now, I know that you all thought that I wasn't using a green screen, that there was an actual black and white Heidegger standing in a pose behind me, but I've now revealed I have been fooling all of you, right? So I'm sitting here in Toronto, and I am, tomorrow, it's a Friday at the time of this filming, and tomorrow, this weekend, I'll be filming, enacting some dialectic into dialogos conversations for John Vervaeke's After Socrates series. So I'm excited to be here. It's really great. Apparently, it's really warm for Toronto. It's cold as fuck for me, but me being the California boy, but apparently it's warm and balmy here for Toronto people. So I'm really glad to be here. And since it's Friday, I kind of have an open day, so I wanted to get some videos there. All right, let's turn to the text. Okay. here we are in the second section. I believe this is the second chapter, I believe. All right, so I'm just going to start reading. What is worthy of questioning in the determination of truth? Truth as the correctness of an assertion, as compelling us towards the question of truth. So I think he's kind of going into, it's been taken for granted that truth is the correlation between basically idea and object, right? That when those two things correlate, we call that truth, has been unquestioned and assumed. And then we have all these problems of logic, right? In the domain of logic, but of how that works or whatever, and all the, all of the problems that poses. But that keeps us in the sphere of logic, but it also conceals the question of what is truth as such, right? And that when we start to question this is when we can start to recover that original question of truth. And so he goes on. The question of truth, as it has been treated hitherto, is a problem of logic. If from this problem, i.e., from the moribund question, a living question is to arise, and if this is not to be arbitrary and artificial, but necessary in an original way, then we have to strive for a genuine experience of what is compelling us towards the question of truth. So as we circle around this question of truth, right, the very act of circling, right, we find ourselves circling around this question. In some sense, we are finding ourselves already encircling a question, right? And I think by saying a genuine experience, right, what is this experience that has us find ourselves encircling, right? And that is something that's concealed up to this point. He goes on. The determination of truth up till now, and still valid everywhere in the most varied trappings, runs as follows. Truth is the correctness of a representation of being, of a being. All representing of beings is a predicating about them. Although this predication can be accomplished silently and does not need to be pronounced. The most common form of predication is the assertion, the simple proposition, the logos, and therefore the correctness of representation, truth, is to be found there in the most immediate way. Truth has its place and seat in logos. The more precise determination of truth then becomes the task of a meditation on logos, a task of logic. He goes on. What can now compel us to turn the usual definition of truth as correctness of representation into a question? Right? It's so obvious, right? How do we see through this obviousness, right, and return to the original question? I think is what he's asking. This can indeed only be the circumstance, perhaps still hidden, that the unquestioned determination of truth as correctness contains something worthy of questioning, which by itself requires being put into question. So again, remember, we're dealing with, the difficulty here has to do with that we are of a tradition. We are an enactment of a time, right? And in other words, by the time that we reflect on something like truth, we are already standing on presuppositions about the matter that is very difficult to see. We see with it, we don't see it, right? So in contending with this, we have to see in some sense what we're seeing with. So he's basically asking the question, how do you see your own eyeball here, right? And because, vision in some sense, we find ourselves with vision. We don't question it. It's invisible to us. We see by means of vision. We don't see vision itself. How do we make vision itself? How does it come to be questioned, right? Especially because you question it by means of it, right? So how can you question it? You end up in all these really complex paradoxes. It's something like that. He goes on, it could be objected that not everything questionable needs to be made the object of a question. It could be objected that not everything questionable needs to be made the object of question. It could be objected. Okay, so why is he raising this? So it could be objected that not everything questionable needs to be made the object of a question. Okay, so just because you can question it doesn't mean that you need to make it a question. We could object. Perhaps, therefore, we want to examine whether and to what extent there is in the usual determination of truth as correctness something worthy of questioning in the first place, and whether, furthermore, it is of such a kind that we cannot pass over it unheeded and unquestioned. So he's getting at so just because it can be questioned doesn't mean that that it's worthy of questioning, right? So we need to establish the worth and necessity of the question of truth. And he goes on, supposing that we claim to be informed about the truth in accord with others and with ourselves. Okay. So this next part. The traditional determination of truth as correctness. We say that an assertion or the knowledge embedded in it is true insofar as it conforms to its object. Truth is correctness. In the early modern age, though above all in medieval times, this rectitudine was also called adequatio, adequation, and assimilation, or correspondence. These determinations revert back to Aristotle, with whom the great Greek philosophy comes to its end. Aristotle conceives of truth, which has its home in logos, or assertion, as assimilation. The representation is assimilated to what is to be grasped. The representational assertion about the hard stone, or representation in general, is, of course, something pertaining to the soul, something spiritual. At any event, it is not of the type of the stone. So in other words, the representation, the thought, the stone is hard, the words, the stone is hard, right, is not of the same property as the stone itself. Like the proposition, the stone is hard, itself isn't hard, I think is what he's kind of saying. Then, if that's the case, then how is the representation supposed to assimilate itself to the stone? Good question. If they come in conformity, by what means is this, by what basis is it conformed? That's a question. The representation is not supposed to and cannot become stone-like, nor should it, in the corresponding case of an assertion about the table, become woody, or in a representing a stream, become liquid. Nevertheless, the representation must make itself similar to the being at hand, i.e., as representing. It must posit the encountered before us, and maintain it as so posted. the representing, the positing before, i.e., the thinking, conforms to the being so as to let it appear in the assertion as it is. So there's something about that which is not unlike the thing addressed, the stone. They're representing the thinking, the assertion, the proposition, in some sense, conforms with the stone without becoming stone-like, that then lets the stone appear. I think he's kind of going, well, why? Right? It is kind of a mystery, isn't it? Especially when you think about this, like, you're constantly making statements. I'm making them right now about the world, right? And those very statements draw what you're making statements about into appearance, right? You're constantly doing that. You're doing that all day. You're doing that in your head silently. You're doing that out loud with people. You've been doing that your whole life. In fact, most of your life is just is predicated on this making assertions about things and assessments about things and using language, both silently and explicitly. Yet, how does that work? Right? That goes unquestioned in some sense. So in some sense, that's so familiar to you and I, yet in that sense, its familiarity is closest to us. But yet when we look at it and we bring it out and we put it as a question, it's perplexing. This is philosophy. This is the thing about philosophy. This is what we're partaking of. That which is the most near is the most, reveals itself to be the most mysterious. Okay, Heidegger goes on. The relation of a representation to an object is the most natural thing in the world. That's what I was just saying, right? So much so that we are almost ashamed to still speak explicitly of it. Therefore, the naive view, not yet tainted by epistemology, will not be able to see what is supposed to be incorrect or even merely questionable in the determination of truth as correctness. I think what he's saying is like, its very nearness in the fact that it works so well participates, I don't know if it's the cause of, but it participates in the naivety, right, that hides the question or makes it unquestionable. Admittedly, throughout the many endeavors of man to attain a knowledge of beings, it often happens, unfortunately, that we do not grasp beings as they are and are deluded about them. But even delusion occurs only where the intention prevails of conforming to beings. So in other words, we can make correct statements, true statements about the world that allow the world to appear as it is in some sense. And we can also delude ourselves when making incorrect statements about the world that allow it to appear not as it is. But the basis, right, is still this conforming. There's this conforming relationship on both accounts, correct or incorrect, right? It all presupposes this conforming, I believe. We can delude others and take them in only if the others, just as we ourselves, are in advance in an attitude of conforming to beings and aiming at correctness. Correctness is the standard and the measure even for incorrectness. Thus, the determination of truth as correctness, together with its counterpart, namely incorrectness, is in fact clear as day. Because this conception of truth emerges, as is obvious, entirely from the natural way, quote unquote, of thinking and corresponds to it, it has lasted throughout the centuries and has long ago been hardened into something taken for granted. Truth is correctness, or in the more usual formula, truth is the correspondence of knowledge, representation, thought, judgment, assertion with the object. Truth, correctness, a bunch of these words. Truth and correspondence. Boom. Okay, next section. The controversy between idealism and realism on the common soil of a conception of truth as the correctness of a representation. To be sure, in the course of time, objections arose against this conception of truth. These objections were based specifically on doubt as to whether our representations reach the being itself, in itself, at all, and did not rather remain enclosed within the circuit of their own activity, hence in the realm of the soul, the spirit, consciousness, the ego. Surrender to this doubt leads to the view that what we attain in our representing is always only something represented by us, hence is itself a representation. Consequently, knowledge and assertion consist in the representation of representations, and hence in a combination of representations. This combining is an activity and a process taking place merely in our consciousness. The adherents of this doctrine believe that they have critically purified and surpassed the usual determination of truth as correctness. But this belief is mistaken. The doctrine that knowledge relates only to representation and the represented merely restricts the reach of a representation, yet it still claims that this restricted representation conforms to the represented and only to the represented. Thus, even here, a standard or measure is presupposed to which the representing conforms. Even here, truth is conceived as correctness. Okay, so I think, let's see if I can just simply summarize this. So people have come along, right? And are just going around making statements and just assuming a conformity, right, about those statements being true and bringing the world into appearance, right? There's the world and our representation of it, and that representation somehow conforms with the world. And when that conformity works, it's correct. And when we try to correlate and make those same statements or different statements and they don't conform, that's incorrect. People have come along and said, well, how does a thought conform to the world? Because the thought is when it's different, fundamentally different in kind than the world. How does it conform? And so they question that and they say, no, even the initial glimpse of the stone is already representation. Therefore, we make representations about something represented. We never make contact with the world as such. And that's this huge fucking argument, right? It has all different forms for 1,000 years, right? In philosophy about the idealists and the realists, where the realists say, no, we make statements about the world and that we make contact with the world, and those statements represent the world naively in some sense, self-evidently. And the idealists say that no, what we call the world is already a representation. Therefore, we don't ever make contact with the world. So what we deal with is representations about representations. And Heidegger is saying that almost sounds like you're actually questioning this notion of correspondence, but it's still in the gravity of correspondence, right? So it doesn't really escape it. I think that's what he's saying. I think I maybe made that, I'm sorry, I think I made that probably a little bit more complex than he was making it, but, consider the source. Okay, he goes on. The doctrine that our representations relate only to the represented, the perceptium, the idea, is called idealism. The counterclaim, according to which our representations reach the things themselves and what belongs to them, has been called, ever since the advance of idealism, realism. So I was just saying. Thus, these hostile brothers, each of whom likes to think himself superior to the other, are unwittingly in complete accord with regard to the essence, i.e., with regard to what provides the presupposition and the very possibility of their controversy, i.e., correspondence, correlation. That the relation to beings is a representing of them, and that the truth of the representation consists in its correctness. A thinker such as Kant, who found idealism and strictly adhered to it, and who has most profoundly thought it through, concedes in advance that the conception of truth as correctness of a representation, as correspondence with the object, is inviolable. Realism, for its part, is captive to a great error when it claims that even Kant, the most profound idealist, is a witness for the defense of realism. On the contrary, the consequence of Kant's adherence to the traditional determination of truth as correctness is simply the opposite, namely the realism in its determination of truth as correctness of a representation stands on the same ground as idealism, and is even itself idealism, according to a more rigorous and more original concept of idealism. For even according to the doctrine of realism, the critical and the naive, the rest, beings, are attained by means of representation, the idea. Idealism and realism therefore comprise the two most extreme basic propositions as regards to the relation of man to beings. All past theories concerning this relation and its character, truth as correctness, are either one-side caricatures of the extreme position or diverse variation in the numerous mixtures and distortion of these two doctrines. The controversy among all these opinions can still go on endlessly without ever leading to genuine reflection or to an insight, because it is characteristic of this sterile wrangling to renounce in advance the question of the soil upon which the combatants stand. In other words, the conception of truth as correctness of representation is taken for granted everywhere, in philosophy, just as in extra-philosophical opinion. I think he's just explicating, right, essentially that I think the most important thing to get is that the question, which one is true, right, realism or idealism, stand on the same soil, correctness. Therefore, the ground of the truth, whoever wins that battle is standing on that I will win by being correct, right? But that's the same soil that they're both arguing upon, right? Therefore, it's endless. This soil itself is what we're trying to get down to. Okay. He goes on, and I think this will be the last part. The more obvious and the more unquestioned the usual determination of truth, the simpler has to be what is worthy of questioning in this determination, supposing something of this sort is indeed concealed therein. I'm going to read that again. The more obvious and the more unquestioned the usual determination of truth, i.e., correctness, correlation, the simpler has to be what is worthy of questioning in this determination, supposing something of the sort is indeed concealed therein. So in other words, the simpler would be the soil that that idealism and realism are battling on, right? This would be something like these arguments get more and more complicated, right? And hide and cover over and flee from the actual, they're not actually arguing about correctness as such. Correctness as such is by definition simpler than which one is correct and the complications of this. Therefore, we're returning to the ground, and by definition, it's simpler, but more difficult. He goes on. Yet the more simple what is worthy of questioning proves to be, the more difficult it will be to grasp this simple in its inner fullness, i.e., to grasp it simply and unitarily as what is worthy of question, i.e., perplexing, and to adhere to it in order to unfold its proper essence, and thus pose it back upon its hidden ground. Okay, so this is this confronting the tradition, right? That the tradition in some sense both hides the soil that it's on, it stands on it, and then is hidden from it, but yet that tradition in that sense preserves it. So to get the ground into question, right, is what I think Heidegger is trying to do, right? And what we are in fact doing, what he in fact apparently is doing in the way he's laying this out. Okay, I think we've gone probably over a half an hour at this point, so I will call this video complete. Mwah.